Today's session, in this session, we will discuss about theory of demand. In last session, we have discussed that what is the meaning of economics, what are the central problems of an economy, and why these central problems like what to produce, how to produce, and for whom to produce. These problems arises in an economy, and how PPC production possibility curve can solve these central problems of an economy. And we have discussed about what is the difference between microeconomics and macroeconomics, positive economics and normative economics, and what is the difference between stock and flow. All these concepts in introduction to microeconomics we have done in session 1. In today's session, we will discuss about theory of demand. It means what is the meaning of demand, what types of demand exist in the economy, and how demand affected by so many factors. What are the determinants or factors affecting of demand, and why demand curve shifts, and what are the main causes behind downward sloping demand curve. So let us start from the first topic, demand. What is the meaning of this? Desire, willingness, and if you want to buy a commodity, then you will definitely demand for that commodity. Demand means to uh, purchase any commodity which you are willing to buy. Demand in economics, an economic principle referring to a consumer's desire or willingness to purchase goods and services, and willingness to pay a price for a specific goods and services. It means in economics, demand refers to the quantity of a commodity which a consumer is willing to buy at a given price and at a given time period. Demand doesn't mean that if you are interested to buy any commodity but you have not actually buy that commodity, that is not called demand. If you want to buy any commodity, you have purchasing power and you are willing to pay for that good, that will be called demand. So in economics, demand includes four main things or four main components included in demand. And that components are, number one is willingness to buy. First of all, you must have a strong desire for any particular commodity which you are willing to buy. Second thing is that the commodity should be available in the market which you want to buy. Third is you must have purchasing power, because without purchasing power, how you can fulfill your demand? So you must have purchasing power. And fourth is you must have willingness to spend. If you have desire for a commodity, you have purchasing power, you are interested to buy, but you are not willing to pay, then demand will not be fulfilled. So, four things, it means strong desire, commodity should be available in the market, third is ability to pay, and fourth is willingness to pay. If you are willing to pay and to buy that commodity, then it will be called demand. So, demand refers to a consumer's desire to purchase goods and services and willingness to pay a price for a specific good or services. Next is the meaning and definition of demand. The word demand is so common and familiar with every one of us that it seems superfluous to define it. The need for precise definition arises simply because it is sometimes confused with other words like desire, wish, want, etc. Demand in economics means a desire to possess a good supported by willingness and ability to pay for it. If you have a desire to buy a certain commodity, say a car, but you do not have the adequate resources or means to pay it will simply be a wish or desire or a want. It will not be called demand. Demand is an effective desire or willingness, a desire which is backed by willingness and ability to pay for a commodity in order to obtain it. It means you must have ability to pay for that commodity. Without ability to pay and without willingness to pay, if you are interested to buy any commodity, that demand will not be fulfilled. So demand means the actual buying or purchasing any commodity by the consumer at a particular point of period of time, that is called demand. Next is demand function. When we express the relationship between demand and its determinants, that is called demand function. In simple words, demand function express the all factors which affects the demand, the relationship between demand and the related factors which can affect, which can influence the demand. So when we express the relationship between demand and its determinants mathematically, the relationship is known as demand function. Demand for product X can be written as like demand for X commodity is equals to the function of Px. Px is price of X commodity. Y is income of the consumer. P0 is price of other commodities. T means taste and preferences. A means actual income of the consumer. EF is future expectations. What will be, we expect that price will increase in future or decrease in future. N is number of population. So all these factors affects demand. So if we show the relationship between factors affecting of demand and demand for X commodity, that is called demand function. Now next is, what are the determinants of demand? You know that first of all, our demand affects by price of the commodity or price of the product. You know that price of the product inversely affects the demand for a commodity. Whenever price rises, demand falls. When price falls, demand rises. According to the law of demand, price and demand have inverse relationship with each other. Due to rise in price, consumer want to buy less. It means at higher price, demand will be lower, and at lower price, demand will be higher. Because each and every consumer, we assume that consumer are rational person, and rational person, being a rational person, consumer want to buy more goods and at a less price. So price and demand are inversely related with each other. So first of all, price of the commodity that inversely affects the demand for a commodity. Second point is price of related goods. Price of related goods or price of other commodities is known as that other commodities also affects the demand for a commodity. And we include in related goods, two types of goods are included. One is substitute and other is complementary. Substitute goods are those goods which can use in place of each other. For example, tea or coffee. If price of tea rises, then demand for coffee will rise. And if price of tea falls, then demand for coffee will also fall. And these are called substitute goods. And in case of complementary goods are those goods which always use together. For example, car and petrol, needle and thread, camera and reel, pen and refill. These things are interrelated with each other. When price of one commodity increases, for example, if price of car increases, then demand for petrol will fall. Why demand for petrol will fall? Because when price rises of a car, then people will not buy a car, then why they will demand for petrol? So if price of car rises, then demand for petrol will fall. So in case of complementary goods, there is an inverse relationship between price of one commodity and demand for other commodity. Third is consumer's income. Income of the consumer also affects the demand for a commodity because consumer income directly affects the demand for a commodity. When our income rises, then demand will also rise. When consumers' income falls, then demand will definitely falls. Goods may be normal goods, goods may be inferior goods, and goods may be necessities goods. So there are three types of commodities which affects the demand according to the consumer's income. Number one is normal goods. Normal goods are those goods which are generally demanded by consumer due to high income level. If income rises, demand for normal goods like TV, scooter, car, fridge, AC, etc. These are normal goods. So if income of the consumer rises, demand for normal goods rises. And if income of the consumer falls, demand for normal goods falls. And second is inferior goods. Inferior goods are those goods which are inversely related with level of income because inferior goods are those goods which are demanded by the person when his income is lower. If income is lower, then we will demand for inferior goods like tone milk. Tone milk is price is less than the full cream milk. But if doctor prescribed a person that you have to take tone milk, then it will not be called inferior. But if you are buying tone milk due to see the lower price of that product and your income is also lower, then you will demand for that product, that is called inferior good. So if you are demanding for bajra or if you are demanding for jowar and raw jute, etc., so these things are called inferior goods. Due to high level of income, you will demand less for inferior goods. And if your income is less, then you will demand more for inferior goods. There is an inverse relationship between income of the consumer and demand for inferior commodities. Third is necessities goods. Necessities goods are those goods which are demanded by consumer without any effect of increase or decrease in income level of the consumer. Either income increase or decrease, it doesn't affect the demand for a commodity because if you necessities goods are like wheat, rice, sugar, and salt, water, these things are necessities goods. Without these goods we can't survive. So in case of necessities good, there is no effect of consumers income on the demand for necessary goods. So demand will be inelastic and curve will be vertical parallel to the y-axis. Fourth point is consumers' taste and preferences. Consumer taste and preferences also affects the demand for a commodity. If consumer taste and preferences are favorable for a commodity, then definitely he will demand more. And if his taste and preferences are not favorable for a commodity, then his demand will be less. Next is advertisement expenditure. Advertisement expenditure means if a company give more spend money on advertisement and publicity and consumer is aware for a commodity to see the advertisement, then consumer demand will be more. And if there is a less publicity expenditure or advertisement expenditure, then people will not aware for a commodity, then they will not buy and their demand will be less. Next is consumer expectations. Consumer expectations mainly related with future price. Consumer expect that if price will decrease in future, then his demand will also increase in future, not in present. So if consumer expect that price will increase in future, then consumer will demand more in present. And if consumer expect that price will decrease in future, then consumer present demand will fall and future demand will rise. Next is demonstration effect. Sometimes we demand for a commodity not for actually for us or actually we need that commodity. Demonstration means if we see that other people are buying that commodity and to see that thing, uh, we also want willing to buy that commodity. That is called demonstration effect. Sometimes people demand for a commodity for by affected by the demonstration effect. So in this case, if you have more demonstration effect, you are influenced by other people's demand or choices, your demand will also increase. In this case, demand directly affected by demonstration effect. Next is population of the country. If country's population increases, then demand will also rise. If country population falls, then demand will fall. Next is distribution of national income. Distribution of national income means if government distributed national income among the country people equally, it means all the country people will be same or equal. They will get same level of income. Their purchasing power will also remain same and their demand will rise. But if income distribution is unequal, then society will divide it into two categories. One is rich, other is poor, and one is we can say that haves and other is has not. In this case, very few people will be rich and most of the country people will be called poor. In this case, aggregate demand will fall, and so if distribution of income is equal, then demand will rise, and if income distribution is unequal, then society will divide it into two categories. In this case, demand will fall. So these are the determinant or factors affecting of demand. One is price of the commodity, next is price of related goods, third is consumers income, fourth is consumers taste and preferences, fifth is advertisement expenditure, next is consumers expectation, next is demonstration effect, next is population of the country and distribution of national income. Now, next is determinants of demand. As we have discussed about this, for price of the commodity is the main factors affecting of demand. It shows the inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. And price of related goods mainly include two types of commodities. One is substitute and other is complementary. And in case of substitute goods like tea and coffee, there is a direct relationship between price of a commodity and the demand for other commodity or its substitute good. And in case of complementary goods like ink and pen, there is an inverse relationship between price of a commodity and demand for its complementary good. Next is change in distribution of wealth. If an equal distribution of wealth is brought about in a country, then there will be less demand for expensive luxuries goods. There will be more demand for necessary goods and comforts item. So if distribution of wealth is equal, then luxurious product demand will be less, but necessities goods and comforts goods demand will be higher. Next is change in price of the substitute. If the price of a particular commodity rises, people may stop further purchase of that commodity and spend money on its substitute, which is available at a lower price. Thus, we find a change in demand can also be brought about by a change in the price of the substitute good. For example, if price of tea rises, then demand for coffee will rise, but demand for tea will fall. So there is an inverse relationship between price of tea and demand for tea. But there is a positive relationship between one commodity's price and demand for other commodity if both are substitutable to each other. For example, price of tea rises, then definitely demand for coffee will rise. Next is demand schedule. What is the meaning of demand schedule? Demand schedule is known as demand table, and demand schedule is a tabular presentation of a commodity. If we present our different quantity demanded at the given different prices, that is called demand schedule. So demand schedule is a numerical tabulation that shows the quantity of demanded commodity at different prices. Demand schedule may be of two types. One is individual demand schedule and second is market demand schedule. Individual demand schedule shows only individual persons different quantity demanded of a commodity at different level of prices. But market demand schedule shows the summation of all the individual demand. If we sum up all the individual demand at different prices, then we can get market demand schedule. And what is demand curve? Demand curve is a graphical presentation of demand schedule. If we graphically show demand schedule, that is called demand curve. So demand curve is a graphical presentation of quantities of a commodity demanded by the consumer at various possible prices in a period of time. Next is demand schedule. For example, this here price of sugar is given rupees 20, 25, 30, 35. As well as price increases, you know that there is an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. So when price of sugar will rise, then demand for sugar will fall. So quantity demanded is at 20 rupees price, demand will be 5. When price rises by 20 to 25, then quantity demanded falls from 5 to 4. And if price rises again 25 to 30, at this price demand is 3. And at 35 rupees price, demand is 2. So demand schedule shows different quantity demanded of a commodity at different possible prices or given prices. So this is called demand schedule. It's a tabular presentation of a quantity of a commodity at different level of prices. And demand curve is a graphical presentation of demand schedule. So there is a inverse relationship between the price of a commodity and quantity demanded. So demand curve slope is always downward from left to right, and demand curve shows downward sloping curve shows inverse relationship between price and quantity of a commodity. It's a negative slope indicating the inverse relationship between quantity demanded and price. As the price increases, quantity demanded decreases, and vice versa. And we can say that if price decreases, then demand will rise. So demand curve slope is always downward from left to right. Now this is market demand schedule. Market demand schedule is the summation of individual demand schedule. In this table, here price of ice cream is given 1, 2, 3, 4, and the quantity demanded by a individual person is given 4, 3, 2, and 1. And B's demand is also given 5, 4, 3, 2. When price rises, demand falls. In case of any individual person, either it may be A consumer or B consumer, whenever price rises, demand falls. So price of ice cream when rises 1, 2, 3, 4, the unit demanded by A consumer will be 4, 3, 2, 1, and the unit demanded by the B consumer will be 5, 4, 3, 2. You can take any other example or any other figures in case of this, but you must have remembered this thing that whenever price rises, you have to take falling demand, because there is an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. And if we add A's demand and B's demand, then we can get market demand schedule. For example, here A's demand is given 4 and B's demand is given 5. And if we add these 4 plus 5, then we will get 9. And A's demand at rupees 2 price 3 and B's demand is 4. So 3 plus 4 is equals to 7. And at 3 rupees price, A's demand is 2 and B's demand is 3. 2 plus 3, 5. And at 4 rupees price, A's demand is 1 and B's demand is 2. So 1 plus 2 is 3. So here market demand is the horizontal summation of individuals' demand. That is called market demand schedule. Next is how we can derive market demand curve with the help of individual demand curve. Here in first diagram, here Jones demand is given, and this curve is downward sloping, and this demand is called individual demand. Here Jones demand is individual demand, and other adverse person demand is also individual demand. But if we add Jones demand plus adverse demand, then we can get market demand. In case of a market demand, demand curve will be more flatter. But in case of individual demand, demand curve will be more steeper. So market demand, because market demand is the summation of individual demand, so market demand curve will be more flatter and individual demand curve will be steeper, because individual demand curve shows individual quantity demanded of a commodity by a single person at given prices. So market demand curve will be more flatter and individual demand curve will be steeper. Next is the difference between individual demand and market demand. What is the difference between these two concepts? As you know that individual demand is demanded for a commodity by an individual person or single firm or a consumer, and market demand is the sum total of all the consumers' demand or the firms in the market. Individual demand is shown by individual demand schedule and individual demand curve, and market demand is shown by market demand schedule and market demand curve. Individual demand is a part of market demand, but market demand is the summation of or total of or aggregate of individual demand. Individual demand curve is relatively steeper and market demand curve is relatively flatter. Individual demand has a narrow scope as it is related to the taste and preferences of a consumer only, but market demand scope is broader because it is related to the taste and preferences of the all consumers. Individual demand represent different quantities of a commodity preferred by an individual at different prices in the market. And market demand refers to different quantities of a commodity preferred by all consumers at different prices in the market. So this is the basic difference between individual demand and market demand. Now next is law of demand. What is the meaning of this law of demand? When if other things or all other things remaining constant or equal or ceteris paribus, when price rises, demand falls, and price falls, demand rises. There is an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. So law of demand explain the inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded if other things or other factors which affects the demand, it should be remain constant. What are the other factors? Like the price of related goods, taste and preferences, income of the consumer, future expectation, size of population, distribution of income, advertisement expenditure. All these factors, if these factors remains constant, then only price will affect inversely to the demand for a commodity. Price is the main cause. Causes in quantity demanded is the effect. So price and quantity have inverse relationship when discussing demand. So if other things remaining constant or ceteris paribus or other things remains constant or equal, as price rises, quantity demand decreases due to the income effect and substitution effect. This is known as law of demand. It is stated by Marshall. Marshall propounded this theory of demand. Now, what are the assumptions of law of demand? In this, according to this law of demand, we assume that, or Marshall assumed that, income of the consumer should remain constant. There should be no change in taste and preferences of the consumer. There should be no change in fashions and habits of the consumer. Price of related goods like substitute and complementary should also remain constant. No future expectation and no change in weather and population size. So if all these things remains constant, then definitely price will affect the demand for a commodity, and both have inverse relationship. Due to rise in price, demand falls, and due to fall in price, demand rises. Now next is why demand curve slopes downward. What are the reasons behind this? There are so many reasons of downward sloping demand curve. Number one is law of diminishing marginal utility. This law is also propounded by Marshall. According to Marshall, if consumer is buying only a single commodity, or if consumer is consuming a single commodity continuously without any break, then as well as he increase the number of units of a commodity, then the satisfaction which he derived from that commodity will start falling. So there is an inverse relationship between units of the commodity and the satisfaction which derive from the consumption of that commodity. So more units, less satisfaction; less units, more satisfaction. And price and demand also inversely related with each other. Due to rise in price, demand falls, and due to fall in price, demand rises. If there is an inverse relationship between utility and units and price and demand, then demand curve will be definitely downward sloping curve. Next is income effect. In this case, we assume that if monetary income of the consumer will not change, due to fall in price, the purchasing power of the consumer will rise. That is called real income. So due to fall in price, real income of the consumer will increase, and due to rise in price, real income of the consumer will fall. So there is an inverse relationship between real income and price. That's why demand curve slopes downward. Third is substitution effect. You know that substitute goods are those goods which can use in place of each other. For example, tea or coffee. If price of tea rises, then demand for coffee will rise. But due to rise in price of tea, demand for tea will fall. So there is an inverse relationship between price of tea and demand for tea. That's why demand curve slopes downward. Change in the number of consumers. If price of any commodity falls, then number of consumers who are demanded for a commodity, they will demand more for that commodity. And if a price rises, then number of consumers will fall. So there is an inverse relationship between price and number of consumers. Because if price falls, the person who are not buying that commodity, they will also attract at lower prices and demand for more that commodity. So number of consumer will rise at lower price and number of consumer will fall at higher price. There is an inverse relationship between price and demand. That's why demand curve slopes downward. And next, fifth point is diverse uses of commodity. Some commodities have diverse uses. For example, electricity we can use for different purposes, milk can use for different purposes, water can use for different purposes. Some commodities have different uses or diverse uses. When price rises, then demand for that commodity will fall, because if electricity price will go up, then we will limited use the electricity, and we use electricity in those cases where that is necessary, but not in all things. But if price falls, then we can use in so many other activities also. So according to the rise in price, demand will fall, and fall in price, demand will rise. There is an inverse relationship. That's why demand curve slopes downward. Now next is exceptions of the law of demand. You know that law of demand states that there is an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. When price rise, demand falls, and vice versa. But exceptions of law of demand tells us that sometimes, in some cases, demand may be increased due to rise in price, and demand may be fall due to fall in price. There may be positive relationship between price and demand. So exceptions are those cases on which law of demand is not applicable. First is Veblen effect. Veblen effect or snob appeal is generally that effect which shows that in case of prestigious commodities, consumer mainly buy that commodity when price is higher. So these goods are related with conspicuous consumption and prestigious goods. They are directly associated with price of the goods. Price rise, demand rise. Price fall, demand fall. In case of given goods are much inferior goods. When given goods price rises, then superior commodities price will also rise at a multiply, and people will not buy due to their less purchasing power, then they have to buy given products at higher price. So Giffen paradox was propounded by Robert Giffen, Sir Robert Giffen. According to him, Giffen goods are much inferior goods. When Giffen goods price rises, then superior commodities price will rise multiply. In case of rise in price of superior good, consumer will not be able to afford that product, so that mm, in necessarily consumer will buy given products at higher price and less demand for given products at lower price. So there is a positive relationship between price of given goods and demand for given goods. Third is emergency. If any emergency exists in the economy, for example, if any war period or natural calamities exist in the economy, then people will not see the price which is prevailing at present in the market. They will buy that commodity, whatever prices exist in the economy. So in this case, price doesn't matter by the consumer, so law of demand will not be applicable in this case. And fourth is expectations about future price. If we expect that in future price will rise, then at present, whatever price is prevailing in the market, we will demand more for goods and services. So these are known as exceptions of law of demand. Now, next is law of diminishing marginal utility. As we discussed about this, that this law is based on only single commodity. When consumer is continuously consuming a single commodity, then the satisfaction which he derived from that commodity start falling. So in this case, demand curve slopes downward. This is the main cause behind this, the slope, negative slope of the demand curve. Now, reason for downward sloping curve, like income effect, the change in consumption that results from the movement to a higher indifference curve, and substitution effect is that effect in case of tea and coffee. When price of tea rises, then demand for coffee will rise, but demand for tea will fall. That's why demand curve slopes downward. Income effect is said that income effect, if other things remaining constant, when the price of a commodity rises, and when the price of the commodity decreases, the real income of the consumer will rise and demand will rise. So, due to rise in price, real income will fall, and due to fall in price, real income will rise. In this case, there is an inverse relationship between price and real income. That's why demand curve slopes downward. Next is exceptional cases. As we have discussed that in some rare situations, law of demand does not hold good. In such situations, the demand curve slopes upward instead of downward, suggesting a rise in demand with rising price. Cases in which its tendency is observed are referred to as exceptions to the general law of demand. Exceptions to the law of demand: in case of given goods, when price rises, then demand will also rise. For example of given goods like bajra, potato, normal goods. In this case, demand curve slopes upward. Next is prestigious goods. There are certain commodities like diamonds, sports car, etc., which are purchased as a mark of distinction or prestigious to show your status or your prestige in society. If the price of these goods rises, the demand for them may also increase instead of decrease. And price expectations, if we expect that price will rise in future, then people will buy more goods in present at whatever prices exist in the market. So the violation of the law in this case is only temporary. Now next is importance of law of demand. Why we study this law of demand? This law of demand is very important because it is helpful for a trader to fix the price of a commodity, and he knows how much demand will fall by increase in price to a particular level and how much it will rise by decrease in price of the commodity. And the schedule of market demand can provide the information about total market demand at different prices. It helps the management in deciding whether how much increase or decrease in the price of commodity is desirable. So law of demand is very important for fixing the price of a commodity and to forecast the demand for a consumer. Next is importance of law of demand, and it is also based on progressive taxation as well as income of the consumer rises. Government can impose more taxes on consumer, and if income falls, demand can be taxes. Government can impose less. And water diamond paradox, it is also important, this law of demand in case of this paradox. You know that water is more useful than diamond, still the price of diamond is more than the water. This explanation lies in law of diminishing marginal utility. The price of commodity is determined by its marginal utility. Since the supply of water is abundant and the marginal utility of water is very low, that's why water is cheaper. And on the other hand, diamond supply is very limited and the marginal utility of diamond is very high. That's why diamond price is also very high. Next is change in demand and change in quantity demanded. This is also a very important concept in this theory of demand. There is a difference between change in demand and change in quantity demanded. A change in demand occurs when there is change in other factors, price remaining constant or same. In this case, demand curve will shift either to the right hand side or left hand side. Demand may increase or may decrease. When demand increases, demand curve shift to the right hand side. When demand decreases, demand curve will shift to the left hand side. This is the diagram of shift in demand curve and movement along the demand curve. You know that in case of movement along the demand curve, here demand curve will not shift. Only we can show with the help of arrow if there is an upward movement on the demand curve, that is called contraction of demand. Contraction of demand and extension of demand exist due to change in price of the commodity. When price rises, demand falls. That is called contraction of demand. In case of contraction of demand, diagram will remain same, but we can show this contraction of demand with upward movement. And in case of extension of demand, demand curve will remain same. If price falls, demand rise, and the movement will be downward. And in case of shift in demand, demand curve will parallel shift either to the right hand side or left hand side. It happens due to change in other factors if price remaining constant. So in case of forward shift or increase in demand case, price remains constant. Only quantity demanded will increase due to change in other factors. So demand curve, if shifts to the right hand side, this is called increase in demand. And if demand curve shifts to the left hand side, this is called decrease in demand. Next is shift in demand. It has two concepts, increase in demand and decrease in demand. Increase in demand refers to a situation when the consumer buy large amount of a commodity at the same price. And decrease in demand refers to a situation when the consumer buy a smaller quantity of the commodity at the same price. And in case of shift in demand, if demand curve shifts to the left hand side, it means it will show decrease in demand. And if it shifted to the right hand side, it will show increase in demand. And if demand curve remains same, movement is upward, that is called contraction due to change in price of the commodity. And if downward movement, it will show extension in demand due to fall in price of the commodity. So movement along the demand curve generally occurs due to change in price only, other things remaining constant. And shift in demand curve mainly exists due to change in other factors, price remaining constant. So causes of decrease in demand is when consumers' income falls, when price of related goods falls, when price of complementary goods falls, when taste and preferences are unfavorable, when price of the commodity we expect that price will decrease in near future, and decrease in number of consumers. So these are the main causes of decrease in demand, and the reverse situation is the causes of increase in demand. Price of related goods, you know that substitute goods are those goods. If increase in price of one commodity, its substitute goods demand will rise, demand curve shifts to the right hand side. If there is an increase in price of complementary goods, then the other commodity demand will decrease. In this case, demand curve shift to the left hand side. In case of normal goods, if demand rises due to rise in income, demand curve shifts to the right hand side. In case of inferior goods, demand curve shifts to the left hand side. Now we can conclude from the today's session discussion that we have discussed theory of demand. In this, we have discussed that what is the meaning of demand. In general, people will demand, that is buy more of a good or services at lower prices than at a higher price. When this relationship is graphed, that is called demand curve. And if we show this inverse relationship with the help of a table, that is called demand schedule. And a change in price results in movement along the demand curve from one point to another. And it is called a change in the quantity demand. And if demand shifts from rightward to leftward or leftward to rightward, that is called increase or decrease in demand. So in today's session, we have discussed about all the concepts of demand and its determinant factors. Thank you.